there at the Free University, but do you go teach at the Free Universities, or do you do this all online?
It's pretty much all online. But I mean, it's possible that I'll do a semester or a summer or a short term, but it's a means to supervise PhD students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where did we last talk or meet or be? Because I'm a little fuzzy on that.
I know that we did talk. It might have been after I wrote Changing Our Mind.
Yeah, I think it was. And we sort of, is this post-apocalyptic Zoom calling, or were we in the flesh, like we actually reached out and shook hands or something outlandish?
I feel like we were together somewhere. Because people were not doing Zoom in 2015. Uh,
No. So we
so
actually met. I just was trying to remember where, because I knew I knew we knew each other, and I know who you are, but I was thinking, gee, when was the last time?
after a while, it's like certain people you just know that you know, but you can't even remember where you know them from. But I mean, after I wrote Changing Your Mind, that was 2014. I mean, I heard from
Yeah.
a lot of people. There was the here's all the people who will no longer speak to me again, but then here's all the people who want to be in conversation. And I think we talked sometime after that.
And I was one of those.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Hey, listen, I'm going to introduce you properly here. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which first goes as a YouTube or a Facebook Live event, stays on YouTube and Facebook, also becomes a podcast, and then goes to various other online forums. Um, and I'm talking today with uh, Reverend Professor Dr. David Gushee, who is an author and a distinguished university professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University, and also chair of Christian social ethics at the Free University of Amsterdam in Holland, as well as a senior research fellow at the International Baptist Theological Study Center. And he is the author of a book that I just completed reading this morning, because my memory is always better when I do the book just
Mhm.
before. And that is Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And speaking of my podcast and all this other stuff, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And my Substack, It Has to Be Said commentary page is at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And the first thing I want to say, by way of introduction, is that I enjoyed the book so very much that I called Ernie, my producer of this program, and I said, let's please add this book as soon as possible to our book club. It Has to Be Read. I have a commentary called It Has to Be Said, and we are adding this book to our book club for August. Um, and so It Has to Be Read book club for August. Our selection is your new book, which, as I say, I finished today. So, first of all, thank you for writing a really terrific book. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for going into some subjects that I really had never thought about. Just pull one example out of a hat, the kind of relationship to the Christian nationalism that emerged in Germany after the doubt cast on the basic faith by the 19th and early 20th century higher criticism movement within theology, a very odd sort of thing, but just wonderful. So before asking you a question, I thought I would begin by reading a couple of what I consider to be kind of introductory sections of your book, that I think set it up well, and in no particular order. They're pulled from various places. This comes from page 85, and I'm reading from David Gushee's book, that is going to be our book club offering for August, and this comes from about a third through the book. Many conservative Christians understand the social changes that erupted in the 1960s and have continued to this day as something like a secular revolution, whether an actual planned revolution, even a conspiracy led by Christ's demonic and human enemies, or simply as a series of anti-Christian social movements. And then jumping down to a passage that I guess is on page 88. when you are fighting a religious, cultural, ideological war for ultimate stakes, democracy is fine if you win. But if you do not win, democracy may not be a matter of ultimate loyalty. Making sure your vision prevails may matter more. Another little section here down on page 124. Vladimir Putin's hope for the war in Ukraine is not just to gobble up that country, but to, quote, wipe out the possibility of any future that looks toward Europe and some form of liberating modernity. Putin's project is a textbook example of authoritarian reactionary Christian politics. And that kind of ties in with those other quotes. And one last one from page 143. Christians who believe in and value democracy should resist leaders who weaken it, even if those leaders say some words that confirm Christianity and criticize those who make Christians uneasy. But in Hungary, Viktor Orban has once again found that Christians are easily swayed by religious rhetoric and by policies that seem to roll back cultural developments that they find unwelcome. And I tied those together because they sort of tell a story not of all the content of your book, but they tell the story, I think, well to place it in the time frame we're living in right now. And maybe I'd put it this way, for the reason your book is so vital, because this isn't just an American story, it's a global phenomena. And you talk about that in your book, which was a big relief to me because not many people tie all this together. So you talk about Modi, you talk about Hindu nationalism, you talk about Vladimir Putin, there's a lot there. So I don't know what you think of my little preamble there, but I think it sets up why we're talking about your book.
I love it. Nobody has done it quite like that, and I love those quotes. You picked some good ones. It's Frank. First of all, thank you for having me in this conversation with you. It's good to see you again,
Hmm.
and thank you for picking the book for your book club. August is a good time. We'll be on pretty much on the brink of the election at that point, and I'm glad that you'll have a lot of people reading the book. Yes, the what I thought I was writing when I first started this project was a diagnosis of what had gone wrong
Hmm.
in America, how we got overwhelming conservative Christian support for Trump. And in the course of the writing, broader historical trajectory became clear to me. And so in the end, the book is about a global phenomenon. I don't really try to unpack, you know, Modi's India or Erdogan's Turkey, but more the kind of right wing nostalgia authoritarianism that happens in Christian countries
Hmm.
sometimes when conservative traditionalist populations feel embattled
Hmm.
and are looking for a savior.
I think something you set up very well was the kind of reasons that lead to the demise of democracy. You actually have some over under almost bulleted points on that.
Yeah,
But the insecurity that comes from questioning our faith is one, and you tied that into the German theological movement of higher criticism that kind of weirdly laid the base for the Christian nationalism and that led into the German fascist movement. You also talk about this in terms of Putin putting himself forth as a savior of Christian values, and of course we have our own Christian nationalism here in this country. But one thing that I really appreciated about your book, and I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a recap here better than I could, is you take us through a kind of a basic argument for democracy and then put it in the context of where Christians in history both got this wrong, but also contributed to getting it right. And I really like that historical dimension to your book. Do you just want to talk about that a little bit before we go further into this?
sure. Um, when you look at it in broad historical sweep, it's actually quite an extraordinary story that Europe gave birth to modern democracy,
Mm-hmm.
because there was this long history of monarchy, um, centralized authority, especially connected to the centuries of Christendom and the marriage of church and state that
Hmm.
really goes back to Constantine, right? So the Christendom project, where top-down authorities throne and alter dictated the terms of civilization, um, that was the default setting for something like 1,500 years.
Yeah.
And then there began to be stirrings of something different. Um, the idea that maybe the government didn't belong to the monarch, maybe the government belonged to the people.
Mm.
And in fact, that centralized authority was a problem, that we needed to diffuse authority
Yeah.
to weaken centralized power, and also the revolutionary idea that state religion was a problem, that maybe we needed to separate church and state. Um, and I show in the book that a certain part of the Christian population helped to lead the way in these innovations and made Christian arguments for separation of powers,
Mm.
separation of church and state, um, religious toleration, democratic self-government, all of that. Um, but meanwhile, there were other Christians who were appalled and were hoping to hold on to the old way, to Christendom and the state church. And of course, in much of Europe, what happened was a gradual democratization, even keeping the church-state partnership alive, like in
Mm.
England, for example, in the UK. In the US, we had something more radical. We had a founding that disestablished religion and separated church and state, but was not hostile to religion. It was benevolent neutrality, I think, was really the idea. But
Yeah.
but but a big part of the story is, in a time where a lot of smart Christians and everyday Christians are attracted to authoritarian people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Donald Trump here, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, we have a long heritage of pro democracy Christians.
Mm.
And that heritage needs to be retrieved, and the arguments that they made for democracy need to be revived urgently, because there's a lot of Christians who appear attracted to an authoritarian and anti-democratic paradigm. And that's what we see, I think, in Donald Trump and in a number of the other politicians that I talk about in the book.
Yeah. Something that's interesting is that, my family with my dad, Francis Schaeffer, in the 1970s and 80s, making the pro-life cause the litmus test for the Republicans. The issue of theocracy and democracy would sometimes come up. You're talking about there were traditional defenders within Christianity and Christian voices that were on the democracy side. And he was one of them, by the way. He would always put that down and say, no, no, you have to understand from our point of view of a Bible believing Christian, speaking as my father would have, we believe in sin. And therefore, the
Yeah.
checks and balances of democracy are absolutely necessary, because even if we have an authoritarian system or a theocracy, and the first person to be in charge is a good person, what about the second person? How do you push back against the lack of checks and balances? And he would argue very passionately and vociferously for democracy. That was part of the pitch, and talk about using democratic means to roll back Roe v. Wade. And then he wrote this one book that was an outlier to everything else he did, a kind of a final breath of extremism at the end of his life, called a Christian Manifesto. And in that, he said, if we can't roll back Roe v. Wade by democratic means, then we need to consider the same means that would have been legitimate in fighting the Nazis in Germany. And that kind of stepped over the boundary. And people who had followed him up to that point called him on it and said, you've always been pro-democracy. Why have you gone here? Francis, this seems a bridge too far. So what's interesting, even at the beginning of the movement that I guess in the end gave us Trump, the kind of, take over the Republican Party by very, very far right-wing evangelical Christians and various iterations. I don't know do you have any comment on that? Because I think it's an interesting little wrinkle.
I do. That's so interesting. What year did your father write that last book?
Well, he died in 84, and I think A Christian Manifesto, if I remember correctly, was published in 82.
Okay.
And
I
then he passed away.
Yeah. I argue in the book that you can actually see this trajectory
Hmm.
um, in in the Christian right, though I did not know that there was evidence of it as early as like 82, 83.
Yeah,
But here's the way I tell the story. Well, many people ask me, what has gone wrong with the Christian right? How did they
yeah,
get there, right? And the way I usually tell the story, and I tell the story in the book, is imagine a community reacting with fierce negativity to every contemporary social change since the
mm,
60s, pretty much.
yeah,
And now abortion, partly through the work of your father, was picked out as the main evil that had been allowed to happen through the democratic
hmm,
process. But there was the sexual revolution and the gay rights movement and I think it's now clear unresolved hostility to the civil rights movement and integration of society was a big part of it as well.
Well, and it predated the
Predated
other
it.
movements.
It did. Yep. And immigration, when immigration was loosened in the mid 60s and
Hmm.
even the rise of mass divorce, which happened from the mid 60s to the 70s and then, all of that. So imagine a community that believes themselves to be being pushed back on their heels
Hmm.
by a liberalizing, secularizing trend, and they need to make a counterattack. Now, what your father tried to do was to make an intellectual counterattack with
Hmm.
all of his apologetics and his books and everything.
Yeah,
And then but then his work got brought into the advocacy of the Christian right, which
yeah,
said, okay, we need to get married to the Republican Party and push them in the right direction and take America back through
hmm,
democratic process. And that was when I came on the scene. I graduated in from my PhD in the early 90s, and the Christian right strategy was in full swing, right?
hmm,
Elect Reagan, elect George W. later, get the right people elected. And
yeah,
in a sense, that strategy is still being deployed.
hmm,
But in keeping with the quote that you found on page 88, what has happened is that little whisper of maybe we have to go beyond democracy that you just mentioned from your dad,
hmm,
that whisper has become a roar in the Trump years. I think even that very quote from your father indicates that, I mean, Trump didn't come up with the idea that we might have to go around the law or above the law or over the law or trample the law. But there have been people on the Christian side. I mean, I remember when I first encountered it, it was when people were shooting up abortion clinics,
yeah, sure.
and that was in the 90s, and they were
Yeah,
making kind of Bonhoeffer against the Nazis kind of arguments
yeah.
about shooting up abortion clinics,
Yeah.
in the early 90s. Um, but those were always like outliers. They were
Well,
not.
and one of the more recent and unhinged voices that used to be more respectable is Metaxas. And he wrote a biography of Bonhoeffer and sort of held him up as a hero. And now he's a huge Trump supporter and basically believes the election was stolen and so forth. So you even see in some individual
Yeah.
people a progression to extremism. It's not just the movement.
Yeah, we're watching individual radicalization as well as movement radicalization,
Yeah.
and so we have. Uh, I think actually, my own experience would tell me that the negative reaction to cultural changes was first met by an evangelistic and missionary strategy. Let's win our culture back for Christ. Let's tell everybody about Jesus. The Billy
Hmm.
Graham strategy, you might say, right?
Right.
And maybe an apologetic strategy and an intellectual argument like your dad. And then, okay, well, we need to get people like Ronald Reagan elected and just kind of exercise political power, but within
Hmm.
democracy.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know exactly when a critical mass of the Christian right radicalized to a place where they would consider essentially setting aside American democracy.
Hmm.
But I wouldn't think it would be a bad guess to put it in the Obama years.
Yeah, I think it was and one of the threads to your book is the reaction
It's always
proposing
reaction.
these things. And I think, there's a quote here, I think it's on page 164, where you kind of nail something and you say, with the notable exception of gay bashing, which Trump did not do then anyway, Trump used the authoritarian reactionary Christian playbook. He would bring conservative Christians access to power, and he would use his own power to advance many of their goals. He delivered on what he promised more than any of prior president in nearly 50 years of the Republican Party strategy of partnering with the Christian right to win elections. And I think, that's point is so well made in the book, which, by the way, I'll just reintroduce to people. We're talking about defending democracy from its Christian enemies, and it's by David Gushee. And we're going to have it as a part of our book club in August, and it has to be read. But I think that last quote kind of encapsulates what happened.
Yeah, and the fact that the three hardline Supreme Court justices that he got onto the court were willing to do what previous Republican appointees had not been willing to do, which was to overturn Roe,
Yeah.
helped to solidify the base. I mean,
Yeah.
Trump will always have the hardcore Christian right with him, no matter what he does, in part because he's seen as somebody tough enough, gutsy enough, um, uncompromising enough to actually deliver. And this also, in the not very good theologizing that has begun to develop around Trump, he's seen as kind of a savior figure,
Sure.
or like a Cyrus figure in that, okay, maybe we don't say he's a good man, but God is using him. And that language is only intensifying right now. I thought we had seen it peak in 2020, but it is, as we now are in another presidential campaign, Trump as savior, Trump as anointed Cyrus figure, and now Trump as suffering servant who's being unjustly put on trial. The religious motifs around him on the right are intensifying, making the Christian right feel more and more like a cult and
Yeah.
less and less like a rational movement of any type.
Well, and more paranoid and embattled,
Yeah.
therefore dangerous. And I guess I'm 71 now, so I've been around this block.
Yeah.
I was part of it. And I guess the way I would put the change to sort of thinking out loud here, I would say that we had a series of litmus tests that we wanted to feed into the system and have the system bring change. This generation of Christian nationalists sees it differently. They have a series of litmus tests that they no longer are going to the democratic system to bring change by legislation. Their litmus tests now preempt the democratic system in importance in their minds, and that's all that exists. And so however we get there is fine. It's no longer let's elect the right president or the right Congress. It's essentially use any means possible. So that's a difference. I mean, we weren't talking about any means possible. We were talking back in the 70s and the 80s about using the systems as it was. And then of course, one offshoot was you were talking about, well, there was the evangelism and then the apologetics. The next thing that happened on the right, with a lot of Christian influence from people like my father, was what you would call a long-term strategy, where you suddenly have people like the Heritage Foundation literally grooming the likes of Amy Coney Barrett for an entire lifetime to get her to the position she's in on purpose. We have a lot of conspiracy theories, but these were actual conspiracies that really did play out in the sense that they had an agenda and they just didn't have anyone who would realize it for them until Trump came along, and in trade for these votes, he had people at the Heritage and other places essentially giving him the lists of what they wanted done, and that was the trade.
Yeah. That's important to add. You had an evangelism strategy, a mission strategy, youth ministry strategy, a cultural strategy, produce music and, institutional strategy. You're building Bible colleges and publishing houses and, all of that. The long-term strategy of putting a lot of money into the Washington scene, heritage and the more explicitly Christian groups like Focus on the Family or Family Research Council, right? But all of that is still within the system. It's a aggressive use of the system, but it was within the system. People arguing that maybe we should end the separation of church and state, or maybe we should just kind of ignore the birthright citizenship that is in the Constitution, or what we've seen is, and I say this in the book, democracy is a matter of constitutional law, but it's also a matter of a culture with norms.
Hmm.
an ethos.
Hmm.
And a lot of how a democracy dies is the erosion of the ethos because the people just, they're not going to play nice anymore. They're not going to do things like respect the results of elections. If they can challenge them in court, they will. And they're going to demonize the opponents when the norm always was something like, I honor my esteemed opponent and I wish them all the best.
Sure.
The conceding elections and respecting the ground rules of civility, or even when a president goes in to give a State of the Union address, you don't heckle the president. You don't
Well,
interrupt.
that came from the idea that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves,
Right.
and we're in service to that. So whatever else we're doing, we're in service to that. We're now Trump does not regard himself as a player in a bigger framework. He regards himself as the framework, and Christians have put all their eggs in this one basket.
And I make an argument for a recovery of the concept of covenant in the book,
Hmm.
partly to say there's been for 400 years Christian language available for
Hmm.
this larger framework. And the larger framework is that a constitutional democracy is a kind of a covenant. It's a covenant among citizens to do our best to advance the well-being of the whole.
Hmm.
And for Christians, we might have religious reasons for that, and for secular folks, they might not. But the idea is we love this country, we love this community of people, we love the uniquely the unique political system that has been developed here over all these centuries, and we want to protect it.
Well, there's a sort of a direct correlation. I mean, you're using the word love, and I know you don't mean it in a romantic sense, but as someone who's been married for a while, Jeannie and I have been together for 53 years, I would put it on the level of being in a marriage that is non-negotiable.
Yep.
And at times you are willing to lose an argument so that you win the war of love and staying in the marriage. You don't drive everything to the wall. You don't nail every difference to the wall. And that's like conceding an election. You love the country. And so you concede the election, whether you feel the next guy is going to do a good job or not. It's like, hey, you don't want to win the battle and lose the war on this. And I think everybody up till Trump played by those rules.
Yeah, I have a genie. We've been married 39 years,
Well, there
and
you go.
it is like that, Frank.
Yeah.
And so like when Al Gore very dubiously was declared to have lost the 2000 election, he played by the old rules,
Yeah, exactly.
and he was the
Well,
one
and I knew, and all sorts of Republicans did. I was campaigning for John McCain. I knew John McCain. He was a friend of mine, and he wrote a foreword to a book I wrote about my son in the Marine Corps.
who.
And he and I got on very well. He was of that old school. I mean, it would be inconceivable to think of John McCain not conceding an election. Just it would be absolutely out of the question. You could never picture the day.
That's right. John McCain was a patriot in the old school way. He loved the country.
Yeah, exactly. I want to change the subject here a little bit and go to a quote. Let's see, where's it from in your book? Page 115, somewhere in there. You're talking about what happened in Germany. And of course, when you start throwing around the words fascism in Germany in World War II, it sounds like you're just calling people's names. But in this case, you're talking about a history. And I just want to read a little piece of this and let's go there.
Okay.
Three Christian paths to Nazified quasi-Christianity is a section, and you say, here is my summary of three paths toward apostate Nazified quasi-Christianity. I think these paths apply far beyond 1930s Germany. Some Christians supported it because they knew exactly what was going on, and they fully embraced this new, quote, pagan brew of quasi-Christian Germanism. They went into DC Lagarde type quasi Christianity with their eyes wide open. Other German Christians supported it or acquiesced to it because they could no longer tell the difference between Lagardian, and I'll let you explain what that is, Germanic pagan faith and historic confessional Christianity. Finally, some Christians supported this toxic and dangerous faith because they embraced the anti-liberal politics that lay behind it. And that seemed to me, as I was reading this book of yours, to be a little bit more the situation we're in. But I would like you to just unpack that because this is a really important historical point. I mean,
I think you just muted yourself, Frank.
Sadly, we know exactly how this story ends, and we have been there before. When I say we, recently, fairly recently speaking, in Western civilization, we've seen this. And I want you to talk about the reactionary aspect. I want you to unpack what I just read, explain it to someone who hasn't read the book, which you all will, by the way, in August, because it's in our book club. Um, but also this particular reactionary strain of like, well, this is our way of pushing back. So we'll attach ourselves to the Fuhrer. We'll go to here for a while. This is for the good of the whole thing because these left wingers are pushing in a different direction. There was a lot of that in the 1920s and 30s. The Catholic Church with Mussolini in Italy, the Lutherans and the evangelicals in Germany. We've seen this play before. And it isn't just saying, oh, well, they're like the Nazis, that kind of hyperbole. There's a real historical thing here. You want to unpack that a little?
Yeah, I've done dozens of interviews for this book, and nobody till now has focused on that chapter that I call The Politics of Cultural Despair in Germany, following the historian Fritz Stern. So I'm glad you wanted to go there. I actually have two chapters that are really 19th century and early 20th century focused, one on France and one on Germany. And in the Germany chapter, I focus on three people none of the listeners probably will have ever heard of: Paul de Lagarde, Julius Langbehn, and Arthur Moeller Vandenbroek. The most recent, he died in 1925. So, and these are characters who are described in Fritz Stern's book, The Politics of Cultural Despair. And what Stern is able to show is that going back into the middle and late 19th century, some German intellectuals began offering a kind of what I call a reactionary utopianism, in which they said essentially everything that we see around us in mid to late 19th century Germany is bad. It is a collapse from how things used to be, how things should be. So it was an attack on liberalism, quote unquote, but also urbanism, industrialism, capitalism, materialism, secularism, rationalism, democracy, and all things Jewish. So the anti-Semitism was there too. And they said, what we need is a national rebirth, a rebirth rooted in, literally the language was blood and soil.
Yeah.
A new unity that overcomes class division. We need to unite around anti-Jewish politics, as we understand that the Jews are responsible for all these problems. And we need this weak parliamentary democracy thing, or to the extent that we have it, is just weakening us. We need a strong man who will unite us and tell us what to do and make Germany a powerful nation.
Yeah, and this was happening, I just want to point out, before National Socialism came around. In other words, this is pre-1933.
In fact, this is late 19th century.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm just making
like
the
40
point
years
because,
before that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's 40 years. The groundwork was being laid. Talk about the long-term project of the
Yeah, that's right.
Heritage Foundation. I mean, it was a 50-year project in Germany, and then they found their guy.
Yeah. And then the religious dimension of this is really interesting. And I think it's really relevant to where we are now. And I'd like to unpack this for a second. Germany had been divided religiously because the Reformation tore right through Germany. And so part of the country was Catholic and part of it was Protestant. They fought, a lot of dead bodies in Germany over that. There never was unity. So people who were hoping for national unity had to figure out what to do about religion. And what especially Lagarde proposed was, then you also mentioned a lot of the certainty about religion was shaken by the higher criticism and the,
Sure.
evolution and all of that stuff. So what they proposed was a kind of German Christianity that doesn't focus on dogma and strips the Jewish elements out of Christianity and kind of makes Christianity a Germanized thing.
Mm.
I call it Germanic quasi-Christianity.
Sure.
And so you keep Jesus, but you make him an Aryan. You make
Well,
him an
one thing you put in, and I'm not interrupting you, I want you to
yeah,
keep going, but I thought it was very clever, was that a lot of this was in their imagination in the same way we talk about bringing America back to God.
right.
The Germany that they wanted to hark back to, it actually never really existed because all these little nation states that had been at war and for years and the Holy Roman Emperor and so forth. In other words, what they wanted to go back to was not really something to go back to. It was something they were cooking up almost out of thin air. I
That's
just
right. And by the way, a mythologized past that you can be nostalgic for is totally impervious to falsification. In other words, somebody can tell you that it never existed, but if you've invested in that dream, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So, so what you had was the adoption of a religious symbol set by these quasi-Christians that was frankly anti-Semitic, reactionary, imperialist, nationalist. Ring any bells, right? And
Mhm.
and some Christians, as I say, the part that you read, some Christians um, said, "Yeah, that's really what we need," and so they were perfectly ready to abandon historic Christianity for this.
Mm.
Other Christians were so theologically puny that they couldn't tell the difference between this quasi Christianity and like the real thing.
Yeah.
And other Christians were like, "Well, yeah, I don't really like the theology, but the anti-liberalism, the authoritarianism, the militarism, the nationalism, they like that."
Mm.
And um, I think that we see this. Here's a quote that I have in here. These men appealed to large segments of German society because they were idealistic and religious.
Mm.
The Beneath pious allusions to Christianity, there was a most thoroughgoing secularization. The religious tone remained even after the religious faith and the religious canons had disappeared. As for Lagarde, he pushed the idea of a national rebirth from a Christian to a secular mystical meaning. For his heroic program, he invoked God's sanction, avowing that God's will and this Germanic religion coincided.
Mm.
Um, okay, so not calling anybody a fascist, this is before Nazism.
Yeah.
I think the parallel is frighteningly clear related to the kind of religiosity of the MAGA movement.
Sure. Absolutely.
It is a long way away from biblical slash Orthodox Christianity,
Mm. Of any
um,
kind.
of any kind.
Yeah.
Not Catholic, not Protestant, not Eastern Orthodox. Your
Yeah.
father would know that
Yeah.
this religiosity articulated by the people who are going around at these rallies and praying about God's special sent messenger, Donald Trump, would know that there's nothing Christian about that.
Or casting their current political fight for Donald Trump in terms of a struggle with demonic forces.
Right, all of that. But that is the kind of religiosity on offer. And so who is attracted to that? Well, we're seeing already the data. People who don't really participate deeply in Christian community, they're culturally vaguely Christian. They like the reactionary ideology and they're connecting that to a Christianity that they don't even understand.
Mm.
And
Yeah, I think the
yeah,
parallel's amazing, and I'm glad you went there because you weren't sort of throwing names around or calling names. You were sort of giving a history, again, a pre-fascist history of Germany and what led to it. And of course, it's so interesting that it had a theological beginning. I mean, isn't that instructive?
yeah, well, in cultures that have a deep Christian history,
Hmm.
the everywhere you look, Christian, you might say symbology is everywhere. There's the church up on the hill, and there's, you know,
Sure.
there there's the cross everywhere, and there's the war memorial that has a cross on it, and the kids are still educated in some form of Christianity in the schools, and um, it's not a Hindu symbol set, it's not a Jewish symbol set, it's a
Hmm.
Christian symbol set. So you can take that symbol set in a lot of different directions. And reactionary politics in historically Christian lands tends
Hmm.
to deploy Christian vocabulary and Christian symbols. Um, in a way that I can only describe as idolatrous or certainly heretical.
Mm.
But then people say, yeah, yeah, this is our guy, and he believes in Jesus, and he wants to make America Christian again too, and so it's the most superficial understanding of Christianity, but it works for some people. Yeah.
Jumping down toward the end of your book, I just want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit about this. So I'm going to read this. And again, this is toward the end. You say, we can reconnect with the 500-year-old democratic strands of the Christian tradition, such as the three we have considered here: congregational democracy, Black Christian democratic struggle. You have a whole section on that, which is excellent, by the way.
Thanks.
And democratic can
Covenantalism.
yeah,
Yeah.
conventualism.
Yeah.
We can reject authoritarianism because we know that God is against tyranny, which is the point I brought up about my father wanting the separation of powers in a democratic system. We can reject it because we know that people are sinful and too much power is too strong a temptation. We may grow weary with democratic inefficiency struggles and wrong turns, but authoritarianism is a siren song to be resisted. We can remember how bad it was when religious majorities were able to impose their beliefs in violation of the consciences of dissenters, sometimes at the point of sword or gun, which, of course, parenthetically, not reading from your book, but just adding, was the beginning of the history of the Bay State Colony, having come from an imposition by James and others of a kind of a church-based religious intolerance in the United Kingdom.
Yep.
With the Church of England. And going back to your book, knowing how important our faith and morality are to us, we can both ask for respect for our convictions and refrain from trampling on the convictions of others. We can learn to accept living in societies with a profound diversity of beliefs. So I'd like you to just unpack a little bit of that whole section.
Yeah, that's moving towards a conclusion in which I'm saying there is such a better Christian vision
Mm.
for being genuinely supportive of the democratic constitutional order that we have.
Mm.
And I have 3 chapters, one each, on strands of the tradition that I think are especially helpful.
Mm.
I talk really the order in which they appear in the book is first the covenantal tradition that began with the Puritans.
Mm.
They were among the first to see that, you know, that the church belongs to the people of God as they covenant together to create Christian community under the lordship of Christ. And now they wanted the whole nation of the United Kingdom to have the same polity, and that project failed.
Mm.
But the covenantal idea has a lot of potential, and I unpack it. And the idea that you might say that any constitutional democracy, at least ours, has a kind of a covenantal foundation to it. And
Mm.
if you have enough people who don't keep covenant, who don't care about truth or lies, who don't keep their promises,
Yeah.
then you can, like, and Donald Trump is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Then you can destroy the constitutional democracy itself, right? So covenant, and then the Baptist tradition is really a little bit more radicalization, that the Baptists by the mid 17th century were arguing for religious liberty, separation of church and state, limited government,
Mm.
getting the state out of enforcing orthodoxy. And they actually were proposing human rights charters by the mid 17th century, way ahead
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
anybody else.
Go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
Then the third, just the Black tradition, it must be said that in the U.S., African Americans have understood probably more clearly than anybody else the flaws in our democracy from the beginning. The way our democracy was damaged by slavery and racism, but they have fought for a democracy in which everybody is included in the covenant on equal terms. They've been fighting for that for 400 years. And so the intellectual, literary, spiritual, moral witness of the Black Christian democratic tradition should be very near at hand as we think about how to protect democracy right now. And
you point out that they paid a price that white people did not pay just for the act of voting, for instance, so that these are seriously, serious proponents of democracy, not just trivial ones.
that's right. You're talking about, Yeah, people who were sometimes lynched for running for office or for voting or whatever.
Yeah,
Or, how, in the Reconstruction period, black people were elected as, senators and Congress people, and then were terrorized out of their offices gradually, right?
yeah,
So I want to say, and I've had a reviewer say there are other strands, pro-Christian strands. You can identify them in the Anglican tradition and in
mm,
the Catholic tradition and in the Orthodox tradition and others. Um, this is a struggle within Christianity to some
sure.
extent as to what our vision is going to be. And I'm begging American Christians and other readers to embrace democracy, not because we don't care about our faith, but precisely because we do care about our faith.
One thing, yeah, and it's a very strong point. And as I say, I do hope everyone reads this book. Plus, we're putting it in our book club. But let me go to something else you talk about that I think fits in with part of the pathology that we are experiencing within the Christian community. Why they went for Trump and his ideas of fake news and everything. And I've said in other places that we were almost groomed to this way of thinking. And you kind of write about that by saying in many religious traditions, and not just in Christian ones, the role of the people is to receive and obey authoritative teaching, not to debate what to believe. Many believers take great comfort in this submission and in not having to wonder what is true and right, especially in a world full of religious and moral conflict and confusion. Meanwhile, multiple biblical teachings urge such submission to authoritative church teachings, and those who offer them consider such texts as this, quote, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will give an account. And, the point I wanted to make is that I think that within our own tradition, we have things, and sadly, I don't even say taken out of context. No, we've got things within our tradition and our scriptures which lend themselves to this. And of course, it's the entire history of Christianity, whether it's the Byzantines or the popes in Italy or the Medici family or anyone else, the authoritative model of submission to teaching within the scriptures and within the teaching of all the strains of the church lends itself to authoritarian figures. And so, in a way, I'm not saying this is my point of view, but I want to toss this out to you. In a way, you could say that democracy, to the extent that Christianity contributed to it, it's an anomaly. It's not part and parcel of the basic teaching, which is far more to do with the leader. The Abrahamic covenant. Abraham is the leader. God gives the law. You're going to be executed if you don't keep it. The big man is always in charge, and that translates into a papacy and the patriarchy of the Orthodox Church. And then, the big man on campus who's the pastor in your local church who gets away with everything because he's the big man and you don't question it and you don't report any malfeasance. So, I just want to throw this out in the context of this discussion because you're a wise, thoughtful person. Not so much that this, and you have this passage in your book, but I think it's worth looking at the issue itself as a function of Christianity rather than, well, the real fruit of Christianity is democracy, and we've somehow wavered from that. If you added up all the points in Christian history where you had the big leader, the big Trump of his era, whoever
Right.
it might be. Unfortunately, I think this is the norm. I think our sliver of democratic practice here in the United States for a few minutes
Hmm.
is the exception.
Um, that is a very provocative way to say it, but it's not that far from what I say in the book because, see, I believe that religious traditions, including their scriptures,
Mm,
have multiple voices in them, and have a course of development that evolves over time.
yeah.
Um, in other words, they're living organic things.
Mm,
And now we were taught in our fundamentalist and evangelical heritage not to look at the Bible that way and not to look at doctrine that way. It was all like one, it was forever revealed one time and never changed.
mm,
By the way, that's one of the reasons why our faith lost a lot of credibility, because you can actually see the different perspectives in the Bible itself, and certainly in the unfolding of Christian tradition. So
mm,
yes, I do acknowledge in the book that there is a deep, deep strain of authoritarianism in the Bible itself.
mm,
And that to find like pro-democratic biblical resources, you have to do some digging, and I do name some places where you can find them. But Christians don't arrive at a pro-democratic posture until a certain moment in history when the hard lessons of authoritarianism and the bloodshed of state church religion
Hmm.
finally almost became too much to bear. And also, you have to have Reformation and the splintering of the Protestant landscape into dozens and dozens of sects.
Hmm.
And it becomes impossible to maintain unity at the point of a sword without killing people all the time.
Yeah.
And so that was a contingent historical development.
Hmm.
And that opened the way for Christians to think differently about authority and to realize that maybe even in the church it would be better to disperse authority. Maybe we're not best with the big man on campus, but instead the
Hmm.
community as a whole functioning to govern itself. Um, so no, I do not say that since the beginning of Christianity, all true Christians have been pro-democratic. No, it's something we learned. But the same thing is true in Western history in general. We learned that centralized authority didn't work well with human
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
And so we pioneered, we innovated democracy. It
Hmm.
was a tremendous breakthrough. It meant that like you and I can't just be arrested and thrown in jail for no reason. And we have rights and there are laws and we cherish and protect those liberties, not just for ourselves, but for others. Tremendous breakthrough. It means the dictator can't just kill us, that we don't live in Russia where Navalny can just disappear and be dead one day and nobody's going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And and that it is better to live in a nation of laws than a nation of one man telling you who's going to live and who's going to die.
Well, even more than that, it's better to live in a very messy, imperfect, nation of laws, however badly applied, than one that's given up entirely on the process. In other words, what my dad always used to said, that if you demand everything or nothing, you will always get nothing.
Yes, that's right.
I mean,
And
that's a good point.
and you even opened up by talking about, your dad saying, yeah, let's say you love Trump,
Hmm.
and you'd like to have King Trump until he dies.
Right.
Who's the next successor? Is it Trump Jr.? You
Yeah.
know, is
Exactly.
it Barron? Is it Melania? Is it, you know,
Well, we
dynasty?
know we know how this rolls because it's called North Korea.
Right. That's
And
right.
we also, to be not sardonic, but truthful, we know how it rolls because I was my dad's nepotistic sidekick for a while before I bailed and fled the evangelical community, but many didn't. Franklin Graham stayed there where the trough is deep and, the money is around and the power is there. And so did Falwell's kids. And how did that all work out?
Yeah, nepotism doesn't do well.
No, it doesn't do well.
Dynasty.
We're supposed to believe in a meritocracy. And speaking nepotism within the Christian community is itself a very kind of anti-democratic impulse. You've got an interesting thing here in talking about the continuing battle for this new thing we call democracy, relatively new to our period of history, certainly to Christianity. Christian Democrats, and you don't mean the Democratic Party, talking about defenders of democracy. Christian Democrats have had to show repeatedly why democracy is compatible with belief in a sovereign God and Christ as Lord, why diffusion of power and society and social equality rather than centralized power and social hierarchy are more compatible with Christian principles. Justifying democracy is made even more difficult by the fact that most modern democracies separate church and state, refuse to source lawmaking in Christian scripture, and banish talk of God from founding documents and political debate. Well, the reason they banished it, just to look, say, at our own history and what came out of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, is they had tried that for centuries, and you got what you paid for. It's Edward III's 100-Year War, with him claiming to do the whole thing in the name of God and defending chivalry on one hand because he's the king, and then giving permission to his troops to rape and pillage and destroy any little village that stood in the way. Been there, done that. And everybody said, the hell with this. Let's find something else that works a little better than the divine right of kings.
Yeah. Well, I think we have historical amnesia that is profound right now. I mean, how many people in America would even know who Edward III was, let alone what he did, right? So we have historical amnesia, but we also have, and the heart of the book is me saying traditionalist Christians in a lot of countries are really susceptible to authoritarianism if they are activated fundamentally by a contemptuous negative reaction to everything that they don't like, that they would call liberalization. Okay.
Well, in
So,
addition to that, you have the MAGA folks who come from places where the jobs aren't frequent and they're angry.
right. Yeah,
They don't have a college degree. There's a huge other thing going on.
that's
But
true.
kind of the capstone of all this is that evangelicals have stepped into hard, bare knuckle politics, win at any cost, the hell with democracy. And that's a new wrinkle. That's not one that I'm familiar with.
I think that evangelicals, and maybe especially a certain strand of Pentecostalism, charismaticism, which was more visible in Trump's coterie than it was in previous Republican presidents,
Yeah.
has actually helped to supercharge this cosmic dualism of battle of good versus evil.
Hmm.
Um, because because the idea that, I mean, the niceties of democracy might need to be set aside because we're doing something much more important right now. We're
Yeah.
battling evil.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe been brewing, but I would think, your average Republican politician, Mitch McConnell, would not believe when he was dealing with Democrats, he was battling evil. He just wanted to win, right? Mitt Romney does not believe that Chuck Schumer is evil.
Hmm.
Um, but a lot of folks on the Christian right have moved to the language of good and evil
Yeah.
and the language of cosmic war. And by the way, culture war, which was initially a sociological description, became almost like a literal. We're in a culture war.
Sure.
And when you're in a war, I quote this guy who says, when you're in a war, you have to win.
Hmm.
And when you're in a war, all means may be necessary, and
Well,
so
and if you're in a war and you see yourself as a diminishing minority, both racially and culturally and religiously, then by default, this war cannot be won by democratic means
that's
because
true.
you will lose. It
And
has to be won by extracurricular activity, whether that's violence and open carry, guns on the courthouse steps, or whatever it may be, because it can't be won by votes.
so that's true. And so you use the democratic system and manipulate it ruthlessly to try to win as a minority. But
Mm.
then you maybe have to consider other stuff too. And that your comment also makes me think this diminishing minority is only going to diminish more over time.
It is.
So maybe that means you have to win now.
Yeah, and or I lived in South Africa for a year during the apartheid regime, directing a couple movies down there. And what's interesting is they made no pretense of democracy. Apartheid was a recognition, this doesn't work for us. We can't control the majority black population. We're not even pretending. So that's the other alternative, and that is to put yourself in a position where Amy Coney Barrett and these other justices carry water for you and do your anti-democratic bidding to legislate from the bench in a way that is demonstrably, by every poll taken, not supported by the people, and impose your will in a different way. And I think our courts are very much in a position where that is becoming the aim. It certainly was the aim of the Federalist list that was given to Trump. Put these guys in and we'll bring the votes. These guys being a right-wing group of judges that were going to, as it were, circumvent the democratic process in terms of what the quote, the people want.
In all the countries that I talk about in the book, the modern countries, and that's Poland, Hungary, Russia, Brazil, and the US, the courts are a crucial part of authoritarian reactionary strategy.
Mm.
Because to the extent that the courts are a check on centralized power, then the courts need to be weakened or taken over.
Yeah, and they have to be taken over by ideological fellow travelers that you've got to know where they stand. And they may not go in your direction every single time, but that's more tactical than it is anything else. In other words, they understand you have to play the game more slowly.
Right.
I want to reintroduce you, and before we close out here, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is David Gushee, who is the author of the book that is going to be in our book club this August. And we'll be hopefully reading it and reacting, and we'd like to have you back more at that time to kind of talk about it. It's called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And of course, the title is very provocative because who would have thought that, we'd arrive at a place in American history where the principal enemies of Christianity, of democracy, are identifying themselves as Christians and calling the rest of us demonic forces of evil. I mean, it is quite a turn of events. Again, having been in the culture wars of the 70s and 80s before they really became wars, as we understand it, in those days, the idea that Christianity was not on the side of democracy would have struck people as very odd, that that Christianity somehow was upholding democracy. So talk a little bit about that fundamental shift, and then we'll close this out.
Yeah. The title came to me 2 years before the book came out. And I some people say, "Oh, that's so provocative. You're shutting the door on even having a conversation with people."
Hmm.
But I could not come up with a different title in the end because I think this is the story. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's it's Christians having soured on American constitutional democracy to a significant extent, finally because they concluded that American constitutional democracy was not delivering the results that they wanted.
Yeah.
And and their electoral strategies were failing at least as much as they were succeeding, maybe more failing. And then somebody like Trump comes along and says, "Let me open for you some different kinds of doors." Um, but meanwhile, I also show in the book that there have always been conservative Christians. I pick out a certain Christian school curriculum that I describe in the book. There have always been some conservative Christians who teach their children an ideology of politics that is not American liberal democracy, that is more like Puritan theocracy or something.
Sure.
So there is a subculture out there that never bought the system that we were in. But
Well, even never bought our Constitution or, the way our government even was formed. They really do believe in theocracy.
right, but they were such a small minority, it didn't matter, right?
Hmm.
Um, so no, I would not have thought when I was opposing the Christian right in 1990 or whatever, I knew that they were participating in the same democratic system. We were having normal democratic political struggle, right?
Yeah.
This is different. Our listeners need to understand this is different.
Hmm.
Um, these are people who are studying, not all of them, but some of them, including people around Trump, who are studying how to weaken the checks and balances and the constitutional restraints of our
Hmm.
democratic system itself. And how anybody could vote on anything other than that issue, because it's the game itself. It's not
Yeah.
who's going to win the game. It's the game itself that we're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. It's not who's captain of this ship. The ship is being scuttled. There's no
Yes,
use talking about who's captain. They are sinking the boat.
that's what I'm saying. We need images like that to help us make this real. And so there are still people who are, I mean, they may vote against the Democrats because there's this or that policy that they don't like.
Mm.
But that's maybe look like you're on the Titanic and you're asking about who's going to sit at what table or what food is going to be served. It's relatively insignificant compared to the fact that the boat is sinking.
Yeah, and we're going to see what the courts are doing. I mean, they've already declared themselves. So, like I say, it's only tactics. But my producer Ernie just sent me this note saying the captured Supreme Court is now weighing in on whether Trump has absolute immunity from a crime one of the justices' wives assisted in the sense that, she was part of the insurrection movement and was actively participating. I mean, this is getting very close to the bone now in terms of overthrowing the system itself.
I quote a conservative writer who used to write for the Weekly Standard. Do you remember that magazine?
Sure.
Matthew Continetti, and he looking in a 600-page book at the development of modern conservatism,
Mm.
says at the end of the book, it appears that what may be happening is the conservative movement is turning against the constitutional order itself.
Hmm. Exactly.
And because the conservative movement is almost ipso facto the Christian conservative movement now, there's really not much of a difference,
Yeah.
turning against the constitutional order itself. And I've been in this business for 30 plus years and I never thought we would be here.
Me neither, but I'll tell you a tiny little canary in the coal mine on this that sadly proves your point. and that is this weird reaction to wanting Vladimir Putin to win against Ukraine. These guys at the gut now are siding with an authoritarian dictatorship that murders its opponents, but pays lip service to their traditional values, hates gay people, whatever. And the bitterness goes so deep that they're not only siding against our own form of constitutional government, they're now siding openly with the enemies of the United States who have sworn to nuke us as part of their tactic to win in Ukraine if push comes to shove. He's always threatening us with nuclear annihilation. Hey, I'll use nukes. He just did it again this week,
Yep.
in reaction to France and Macron saying maybe someday it'll take French troops on the ground to help defend Ukraine. He said, well, then, we're looking at nuclear Armageddon and the end of everything. Turn around and there are Christian pastors siding with this. This is our enemy. So they've now stepped from sort of kind of a little bit sympathetic to literally siding with Vladimir Putin against you and me and the United States of America. And that is how far this has gone.
I agree. And Trump signaled this because he always, when he was running for president and when he was president, and now he has a strange love of Putin, but also he always is drawn to authoritarian leaders, and the movement is as well. The chapter on Hungary talks a lot about the affection
Sure.
for Viktor Orban on the part of the right in the U.S. I believe democracy is worth defending and protecting.
Yeah.
To do that, we have to know what the depth of the threats to democracy look like, and hopefully I've done a decent job in describing that in the book.
Yeah,
So,
you've done a great job, and I want to introduce it to people as our book club for August, and just say, listen, it's a tired phrase, but this is actually a must read. We talk about this a lot, but this book is essential because you've laid out something anybody that wants to understand what's happening to us, whether they're interested in Christianity per se or not, you can't really get it unless you read this book, because this is what it's about. So I want to thank you so much, David Gushee, for being with us today. And I want to say one more time that we're making this part of our book club. And David is the author of Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And I would ask you to please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and also go to my Substack page, It Has to Be Said, and subscribe there at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So thank you very much, David. Great discussion, great book. Really loved reading it. Would love to have just read the whole thing out loud here, but I did get into some quotes anyway.
thank you so much. Thanks for your careful engagement with the book, and your history helps, and your validation of the book helps me feel like I'm onto something here. And so thank you. And I look forward to another conversation, maybe when your book club is meeting.
Yeah, we would love to do it. Thanks so much. Really, really great.